Welcome, dear listener, to this journey back through time into the intimate lives of medieval women. Whether you're winding down after a long day or already tucked comfortably in bed, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time exploring history together. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. Are you somewhere on the other side of the globe, just starting your day as I record this? Or perhaps we're passing the midnight hour at the same time, an ocean apart. If you enjoy relaxing to the gentle murmur of voices sharing stories from long ago, I invite you to click that subscribe button. There are many more peaceful meanders through history to come, but for now, make yourself comfortable and let your mind drift back to a time so different from our own, to medieval Europe around the 12th to 14th centuries. Imagine stone castles towering over muddy roads, thatched roof cottages nestled together in villages, and cathedrals piercing the sky. Bells toll in the distance as farmers toil in the fields and blacksmiths hammer away at their forges. In this world, life for women was often a mystery, their health shrouded in superstition and tradition passed down from mothers to daughters. With limited medical knowledge, medieval people faced the very human challenges of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth, with a mix of inherited wisdom, religious belief, and sometimes misguided ideas. Yet despite the limitations of their time, medieval women developed fascinating and occasionally surprisingly advanced practices around their menstrual cycles, fertility, and the birth of their babies. Over the next hour or so, we'll explore what life was really like for them, from the humblest peasant to the most high-born lady. Along the way, we'll meet some remarkable figures like the 12th century German abbess Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote about women's health with startling insight. We'll witness the dangerous reality of childbirth in a time when giving life often meant risking death. And we'll see how women came together to support each other through these most intimate of trials. So let us begin our story in a world where the mysteries of the female body were explained not by medical textbooks, but by a tapestry of herbal lore, folk wisdom, and religious teachings. A world where red-stained rags and rushes whispered of hidden powers, and a woman's womb was believed to wander inside her body. The Middle Ages held many misconceptions about menstruation we would dismiss as mere superstition today. Menstrual blood was alternately feared as a dangerous toxin and revered as a potent elixir. Some believed it could cure leprosy, wither crops, or curdle milk. In the 13th century, writings of Pseudo Albertus Magnus, menstrual blood is described as venomous, able to drive dogs mad, blunt swords, and cause trees to lose their fruit. Yet among these fanciful ideas, grains of truth and practical understanding emerged. In her book, Causae et Curae, or Causes and Cures, the remarkable 12th century Benedictine nun, Hildegard of Bingen, wrote with deep empathy about the pain some women experienced during their monthly flow, and suggested soothing remedies like rest, hot compresses, and herbal baths. Born in 1098 to a noble German family, Hildegard was a true polymath, a writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and naturalist. At the age of 8, she was tithed to the church and began her education under the care of a learned anchoress named Jutta. Despite frequent illness, Hildegard thrived intellectually, eventually founding her own monastery and penning works on subjects as diverse as theology, botany, and medicine. Hildegard's medical writings demonstrate a surprisingly holistic understanding of women's health for her time. She linked menstrual pain to diet and emotional distress, and argued that suppressing menstruation through extended fasting could endanger fertility. While some of her advice was misguided by modern standards, like using boiled puppy meat to treat cramps, her perspective was notably free of the misogynistic moralizing that colored many male writers' views of menstruation. For an average medieval woman, managing menstruation was an exercise in discretion and making do with simple materials. Linen rags, or strips of cotton fabric, washed and reused, were common menstrual dressings. Poorer women might use wads of soft moss or grass to catch their flow. These might be held in place by a belt or girdle around the hips. Bathing was infrequent, so odor was often masked with sprigs of sweet herbs like lavender or rosemary tied around the waist or neck. For pain relief, women might drink herbal tinctures of motherwort or thistle. These remedies were passed down from mother to daughter, or shared in whispers between friends. A noblewoman, attended by maids, had the luxury of changing her dressings frequently. She might retreat to her solar or private chamber during her cycle. But for a peasant woman, there was little rest from daily labor. She might bleed into her woolen leggings as she bent to harvest wheat or trudged to market with a basket balanced on her hip. Despite the messy realities of menstruation, a woman's monthly cycle was seen as an important sign of her fertility. Irregular bleeding was often treated with herbal brews or bloodletting in an attempt to restore balance. A woman who bled too much was thought to be at risk of losing her vital essence, while one who bled too little might be congested with toxic humors. The cessation of menstruation, then, was a signal that a new chapter was beginning. The perilous and promising journey of pregnancy. In a time when childbirth was the leading cause of death for women, the stakes of that journey could not have been higher. One of the youngest recorded mothers in medieval Europe was Margaret Beaufort, who would go on to become the formidable matriarch of the Tudor dynasty. Born in 1443 to a wealthy English family, Margaret was just a child herself when she was married to the king's half-brother, Edmund Tudor, at the age of 12. At 13, Margaret became pregnant. Petite even by the standards of her time, the delivery was incredibly difficult for her young body. After a prolonged labor, she gave birth to the future King Henry VII, but the ordeal left her unable to bear more children. Margaret's experience, while extreme, was not unusual. Many medieval women gave birth in their teenage years, their bodies not yet fully developed. Prenatal care in the Middle Ages was a mixture of sensible advice and superstition. Health manuals like the 13th century Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, or the Salernitan Rule of Health, emphasized the importance of moderate exercise, fresh air, and a diet rich in white meats like chicken and fish. Pregnant women were advised to avoid strong emotions like anger or grief, believed to adversely affect the baby. Spiritual practices were also thought to ensure a healthy pregnancy. Expecting mothers might wear charms or amulets decorated with symbolic gemstones, or recite special prayers to the Virgin Mary for protection. Some even undertook pilgrimages to holy sites, hoping for blessings and divine intervention. Midwives, respected women in the community with practical experience in childbirth, played a key role in prenatal care. They might prescribe herbal tonics and poultices, or advise on diet and activity. As pregnancy progressed, midwives began to make regular home visits, palpating the mother's belly to assess the baby's position and growth. Yet even with a skilled midwife's care, pregnancy was fraught with dangers. Miscarriage was common, and often attributed to supernatural causes like witchcraft, demons, or the evil eye. A woman who miscarried might be viewed with suspicion, her womb deemed corrupted or cursed. As the expectant mother neared the end of her pregnancy, female relatives would gather to assist in preparations for the birth. Linens were washed and aired, candles and lamps readied to light the birthing chamber. A fire was kindled to warm the room and boil water for cleaning. The midwife would assemble her tools, scissors to cut the umbilical cord, thread to tie it, and herbs to steep for pain relief. When labor began, the mother might clutch a relic or saint medallion, praying in between contractions. Her companions would massage her back and belly with oils, offer sips of calming teas, and murmur encouragement. The midwife would monitor the baby's descent, feeling for the crown of its head. The scene of a medieval birth could be chaotic, the air thick with sweat and incense, and the cries of agony as the mother strained to push the baby into the world. Forceps and other instruments were not yet in use, so if the baby became stuck, the midwife had to reach in and attempt to manually manipulate it out, a risky maneuver for both mother and child. In noble households, the birthing chamber became a female-dominated sanctum during labour, men banished outside. This was true even for royal births, attended by the highest-ranking ladies of the court. When Queen Blanche of Castile, wife of Louis VIII of France, gave birth to the future St. Louis in 1214, the room would have been crowded with attendants. Blanche was a formidable figure in her own right, renowned for her piety and her shrewd political mind. Over the course of her marriage, she would give birth to 12 children, 10 of whom survived infancy. A remarkable feat in an age of high child mortality. As regent for her young son Louis IX, Blanche skillfully navigated court intrigues and power struggles, laying the foundations for his later reign. But in the throes of labour, even a queen was vulnerable, her life in the hands of God and the women surrounding her. Childbirth was an act of courage, each contraction a battle in the long war of bringing forth life. In the aftermath of that struggle, as the midwife placed the vernix-slick newborn on the mother's chest, a new challenge began, the crucial and danger-fraught early days of an infant's life. The child would be swaddled tightly in linen strips, its head bound to protect the soft fontanelle. A small knife or other sharp implement might be tucked into the swaddling, a talisman against evil spirits. If the family had the means, a wet nurse would be hired to breastfeed the child. As colostrum, the antibody-rich first milk was believed to be harmful. Poorer women had no choice but to nurse their own babies or to cross-nurse within their communities when possible. The new mother, exhausted and sore, would begin her lying-in period, a time of postpartum confinement that typically lasted 3 to 4 weeks. Female relatives and neighbours would help care for the recovering mother, cooking nourishing foods like chicken soup, changing bedding, and handling household tasks. This time of enforced rest served a dual purpose, not only to allow the mother to physically heal, but to protect her from a world still rife with superstitions around the unclean nature of a postpartum woman. In some traditions, she was forbidden from entering a church until she had undergone a ritual purification at the end of her lying-in. The weeks and months after birth were an emotional and spiritual trial as much as a physical one, something the 15th century English mystic Marjorie Kempe wrote about with unflinching honesty. After a difficult first labour that left her feeling out of her mind, Kempe experienced what modern experts believe was a case of postpartum psychosis, plagued by auditory and visual hallucinations. In her autobiography, the first known such work in the English language, Kempe recounted her torment and the lack of understanding she faced. "They said I had lost my senses," she wrote of her family and neighbours, "that a devil had power over me. Some wished to bind me fast, lest I hurt myself or others." Kempe's experience, harrowing as it was, sheds light on the psychological impact of birth in a time before postpartum mood disorders were understood. Her eventual recovery through prayer and pilgrimage became the catalyst for a spiritual awakening that transformed her life. For medieval mothers, the greatest solace often came from the company of other women. Whether sitting beside a friend's lying in bed, nursing each other's babies, or keening together over a tiny grave, women formed the backbone of social support. They carried the wisdom of generations, passed down in birthing charms and herbal remedies, lullabies and cautionary tales. In a world where medical knowledge was limited and childbirth so perilous, this collective women's knowledge was a powerful tool for survival. Midwives in particular were repositories of hard-earned obstetric skill, learning through apprenticeship and experience how to ease long labours, turn breech babies, and stem postpartum hemorrhage with pressure and poultices. Though they left little written record, medieval midwives were the unsung heroines of their time. They ushered countless lives into the world with deft hands and quiet incantations, their expertise hard-won through blood and sweat, and too often tragedy. It's a legacy that echoes down through the centuries, the bonds of sisterhood forged in the crucible of life's most primal moments. And though we may view medieval birthing practices through the lens of our modern medical understanding, there is still much we can learn from the intuitive wisdom and communal support that sustained women through the trials of menstruation, pregnancy, and labor. In our own time, as we rediscover the power of doula care, the importance of postpartum rest, and the healing potential of herbal medicine, we are in a sense reconnecting with the knowledge of our foremothers. We are remembering that birth is not just a medical event, but a profound rite of passage, one that has always called for the supportive presence of other women. So let us honor the courage and resilience of the medieval mothers who came before us, who faced the mysteries and the dangers of their female bodies with grit and grace. Let us remember that their stories are woven into the fabric of our own, their strength and wisdom echoing in our bones. And let us hold space for each other, as they did, in the sacred work of bringing forth life. For in the end, that is perhaps the greatest lesson they have to teach us, that we are all midwives to each other's becoming, all birthers of the future we dream into being. So rest now, dear listener, and let the tales of these women from long ago carry you into the realm of dreams. May you awaken with renewed reverence for the mystery and the might of the female body, and for the sisterhood that sustains us all. Good night. Of course, the vast majority of medieval people spent their entire lives within a day's walk of their birthplace. Travel was difficult, dangerous, and rare, but St. Hildegard's story is a remarkable exception. Born in 1098 to a noble family in the lush Rhineland region of what is now Germany, Hildegard began having mystical religious visions at the tender age of 3. As was common for noble girls at the time, she was dedicated to the church at a young age. Placed in the care of a devout anchoress named Jutta when she was 8 years old, Hildegard spent much of her youth in quiet prayer and contemplation, honing her deep spiritual gifts. But the quiet life of an anchoress could not contain Hildegard's visionary spirit and keen intellect for long. In her early 40s, she experienced a series of powerful visions that she interpreted as a divine call to share spiritual wisdom with the world. With the blessing of the Pope, Hildegard embarked on an extraordinary career as a writer, composer, philosopher, naturalist, and medical practitioner. She founded 2 monasteries, corresponded with popes and emperors, and undertook 4 preaching tours across Germany, a staggering feat for a woman of her time. Among her many works, Hildegard wrote extensively on issues of women's health, documenting medieval medical practices with remarkable insight and clarity. In her book Causae et Curae, or Causes and Cures, she detailed the qualities and uses of various herbs to treat gynecological ailments. She described the symptoms of menstrual cramps and PMS with an accuracy that would not be out of place in a modern medical textbook. Hildegard recommended soothing herbal baths and poultices to relieve menstrual pain, as well as dietary advice to promote regularity and ease heavy bleeding. Hildegard's holistic approach to women's health emphasized balance and moderation. She believed that menstruation was a natural cleansing process that should not be suppressed, but also warned that excessive bleeding could lead to weakness and disease. To maintain a healthy equilibrium, she advised women to eat nourishing foods, get plenty of rest, and avoid strenuous activity during their periods. While some of her ideas may seem quaint or outdated today, Hildegard's emphasis on self-care and attunement to the body's natural rhythms feels remarkably modern. Of course, Hildegard was an exceptional figure, a brilliant abbess with the rare privilege of education and influence. For the vast majority of medieval women, managing menstruation was a much more mundane affair, dictated by the practical realities of their daily lives. Peasant women, who made up the bulk of the female population, had little access to the fine linen rags or sponges used by wealthier women. Instead, they likely made do with scraps of cloth, bundled moss or grass to absorb menstrual flow. Imagine, if you will, the life of a typical peasant woman in a small English village around the year 1300. Let's call her Matilda. Matilda likely began menstruating around the age of 14, as medieval girls matured later than their modern counterparts due to poorer nutrition. With no access to disposable pads or tampons, Matilda would have had to carefully wash and reuse any absorbent cloths each month. She might have carried a small pouch of dried herbs like mugwort or yarrow to help with cramps and heavy bleeding. Despite the added discomfort and inconvenience, menstruation did not typically stop medieval peasant women from going about their daily labours. Matilda would have been expected to continue working in the fields, tending to livestock, cooking, cleaning, and caring for children throughout her period. In an agricultural society where survival depended on everyone's contributions, there was little room for rest or special accommodations. However, menstruation did carry a heavy weight of social stigma and superstition in the medieval world. Many people believed that menstrual blood was poisonous or contaminating, capable of causing crops to wilt, wine to sour, and even dogs to go mad. Menstruating women were often forbidden from entering churches or handling sacred objects. Some medical texts claimed that a man could become ill or impotent if he had intercourse with a menstruating woman. At the same time, menstrual blood was sometimes seen as having powerful magical properties. Hildegard claimed that the blood of a pure maiden could cure leprosy. Other folk traditions held that menstrual blood could tame wild beasts, make love potions more potent, or even render a man invisible. Of course, most of these ideas have no basis in scientific fact, but they reflect the potent mix of fear, awe, and mystery that surrounded menstruation in the medieval imagination. As Matilda entered her late teens and early 20s, her thoughts would have increasingly turned to marriage and the prospect of bearing children. In the medieval world, a woman's worth and social status were largely defined by her fertility. A newly married peasant woman would have been under immense pressure to prove herself by becoming pregnant quickly. Infertility was seen as a shameful failure, a sign of divine disfavor, or even demonic possession. But conception was only the first hurdle in the perilous journey of medieval motherhood. Prenatal care as we know it today simply did not exist. Pregnant peasant women like Matilda continued their daily labours for as long as they were physically able, often up until the moment of delivery. The idea of resting or limiting activity during pregnancy would have been laughable to a woman who needed to plough fields, haul water, and wrestle livestock to ensure her family's survival. That's not to say that medieval people were entirely ignorant of the special needs of pregnant women. Midwives and experienced mothers passed down folk wisdom about how to ease the discomforts and promote a healthy pregnancy. Hildegard and other medical writers advised pregnant women to eat nourishing foods like soft-boiled eggs, chicken, and small amounts of red wine to build up their strength. They also recommended moderate exercise and fresh air to prevent a difficult labour. However, many of the dietary restrictions placed on pregnant women were based more on superstition than medical knowledge. Pregnant women were often warned not to eat cooling foods like raw fruits and vegetables, for fear they would harm the baby. Some believed that eating strawberries or raspberries could cause birthmarks, while consuming spicy foods was thought to make the child ill-tempered. In a world where famine and malnutrition were constant threats, these taboos likely did more harm than good. As her pregnancy progressed, Matilda would have increasingly relied on the wisdom and experience of the village midwife, a woman who likely learned her trade through years of apprenticeship and observation. In the absence of professional medical care, midwives were the guardians of women's reproductive health, assisting with everything from fertility issues and prenatal care to delivery and postpartum recovery. The relationship between a medieval midwife and her clients was often intimate and deeply personal. Midwives were privy to the most private details of women's lives, from the timing of their menstrual cycles to the paternity of their children. They were often called upon to provide emotional support and reassurance as much as physical care. In a world where childbirth was a potentially deadly ordeal, the calm presence of a skilled midwife could make all the difference. As Matilda's time drew near, she would have retreated into the darkened, stuffy confines of the birthing chamber. Attended by her midwife and perhaps a few close female relatives, she would have labored for hours or even days, enduring the agony of contractions without the aid of modern pain relief. The midwife might have offered herbal teas or poultices to ease her discomfort, or performed manual manipulations to help the baby descend. If labor was progressing slowly, the midwife might resort to more drastic measures, like inducing vomiting to relax the muscles, or even opening the cervix with her fingers. These interventions were not without risk, and could sometimes cause more harm than good. But in a world without antibiotics, C-sections, or advanced medical technology, midwives had to rely on their own skill and intuition to navigate the dangers of childbirth. Assuming all went well, Matilda would have finally delivered her child into the waiting hands of the midwife. The infant's umbilical cord would be cut and tied off, and any breathing difficulties addressed by suctioning the mouth and nose, or even blowing into the lungs. The exhausted mother would then be cleaned up and made as comfortable as possible on a bed of fresh straw. In the days and weeks after delivery, Matilda would have remained confined to the postpartum chamber, a warm, dimly lit space designed to promote healing and bonding with the newborn. Her midwife and female relatives would have tended to her physical needs, preparing nourishing foods like rich broths and ales to help her regain her strength. They would also have taught her the basics of infant care, from swaddling and bathing to recognizing the signs of illness. One of the most important aspects of postpartum care was ensuring that the new mother had adequate time to rest and recover. The lying-in period, as it was known, typically lasted from 3 to 6 weeks, depending on the woman's social status and the demands of her household. During this time, the new mother was expected to stay in bed, avoid heavy labor, and focus on nursing and bonding with her child. Of course, for many peasant women like Matilda, the idea of a prolonged period of postpartum rest would have been little more than a fantasy. With mouths to feed and work to be done, they likely had to resume their daily labors far sooner than was ideal for their physical recovery. Nonetheless, the lying-in period represented an important acknowledgement of the physical and emotional toll of childbirth, and the need for women to be supported and cared for during this vulnerable time. As Matilda adjusted to the demands of motherhood, she would have faced a host of new challenges and responsibilities. Breastfeeding was the norm in medieval society, with infants typically nursed for the first 2 to 3 years of life. But not all women were able to produce enough milk to fully nourish their babies, especially if they were undernourished themselves. In these cases, wet nurses might be employed to supplement the mother's milk, a practice that was more common among the upper classes. Medieval medical texts placed great emphasis on the quality of the nursing mother's milk, believing that it could influence everything from the child's physical health to their moral character. Wet nurses were carefully screened for their diet, temperament, and even the color and consistency of their milk. But for peasant women who could not afford such luxuries, the burden of nourishing their infants fell squarely on their own shoulders. As her child grew and thrived, Matilda would have taken great pride in her role as a mother and a caretaker. But she also would have known that the joys of parenthood came with great risks and sacrifices. In a world where as many as 1 in 3 infants died before their first birthday, the spectre of loss was never far from a medieval mother's mind. Even if they survived the perils of infancy, children in medieval society faced a host of dangers and hardships. Malnutrition, disease, accidents and violence claimed countless young lives. often leaving parents to grapple with the unthinkable pain of burying their own offspring. For peasant families who depended on their children's labor to survive, the death of even one child could be an economic as well as an emotional catastrophe. And yet, despite the many challenges they faced, medieval women like Matilda found ways to endure and even thrive. They drew strength from their faith, their families, and their communities. They passed down knowledge and traditions from one generation to the next, ensuring that the hard-won wisdom of their foremothers was not lost. And they found joy and meaning in the everyday miracles of life, from the first stirrings of new life in their wombs to the sight of their children running and playing in the sun. As we look back on the lives of medieval women from the vantage point of the 21st century, it's easy to focus on the hardships and injustices they endured. But to do so would be to overlook the incredible resilience, courage, and ingenuity of these remarkable women. Through their stories, we catch a glimpse of a world that is both strangely foreign and hauntingly familiar, a reminder of the enduring strength and grace of the human spirit. In the end, perhaps the greatest legacy of medieval women like Hildegard and Matilda is the way they challenge us to rethink our assumptions about the past and the present. They remind us that even in the darkest and most difficult of times, women have always found ways to care for themselves and each other, to pass down knowledge and wisdom, and to create lives of purpose and meaning. As we drift off to sleep, let us hold these women in our hearts and minds, honoring their struggles and their triumphs, and drawing strength from their example. For in the end, their stories are our stories, their struggles are our struggles, and their courage and resilience are a part of the enduring human spirit that lives on in each and every one of us. Let's pick up our story in the postpartum period, when the ordeal of labor and delivery was over, but the challenges were far from finished for medieval mothers. After the midwife cut the umbilical cord and delivered the afterbirth, the focus shifted to caring for the newborn infant. One of the first orders of business was to clean and swaddle the baby. Midwives or female attendants would wash the vernix, or waxy white substance, from the baby's skin using water, oil, or sometimes even wine. Babies were then tightly wrapped in linen strips called swaddling bands. People believed this would help the infant's limbs grow straight and keep them warm and protected. From our modern perspective, this practice seems very restrictive, but swaddling was the norm in medieval times and thought to be essential for the baby's well-being. Once the baby was clean and swaddled, it was time to begin breastfeeding. Breast milk was really the only safe option for feeding infants in an era long before modern formula, pasteurization, and refrigeration. But interestingly, many medieval parents were suspicious of the first milk that mothers produced, a yellowish substance called colostrum. Some medical texts at the time called colostrum evil and claimed it could make the baby ill. As a result, many new mothers squeezed out and discarded this early milk, waiting a few days for the mature white milk to come in before beginning to nurse. This was an unfortunate practice since we now know colostrum is full of immune protective properties that are incredibly beneficial for newborns. But without this knowledge, medieval families did what they thought was best to keep the baby safe and healthy. Meanwhile, the new mother would begin her lying-in period, typically spending 3 to 4 weeks, mostly confined to bed. This was a time for rest, recovery, and bonding with the infant after the physical demands of pregnancy and childbirth. Female relatives and attendants would take charge of practical matters, keeping the mother warm and nourished with strengthening foods like meat broths and hearty stews. During this month-long lying in, mothers were largely sheltered from the outside world and the demands of daily chores and responsibilities. It was a protected time, a brief respite before they had to resume their many duties as medieval wives and mothers. This might sound like a nice break to modern ears, but the lying-in period could also be quite isolating and emotionally challenging for some women. One fascinating account of postpartum confinement comes from a 15th century English woman named Marjorie Kempe. Marjorie is best known as a Christian mystic who went on pilgrimages and had intense religious visions, but she began her adult life in a more conventional way, as a wife and mother in the town of Lynn. In her later autobiographical writings, Marjorie vividly describes her first birth and lying-in period around the year 1393. She recalls being confined to a dark room for 6 weeks after a long and difficult labour that left her physically exhausted. On top of this, Marjorie writes that she was tormented by demonic visions and sank into a deep depression. In her despair, Marjorie says she ripped at her skin until she bled and cried out that she had forsaken God. Her attendants called in a priest who listened to her confession and comforted her. After this, Marjorie began to recover, but she never forgot the trauma of those postpartum weeks. Historians have suggested she may have suffered from what we now call postpartum depression or psychosis. Marjorie Kempe's story reminds us that although the lying-in period was meant to be a time of rest and healing, it could also be accompanied by psychological distress. Her vivid account offers a rare glimpse into the emotional world of a medieval mother. It's a poignant reminder that while the details are different, women then and now are united by the profound and sometimes overwhelming transformation of becoming a mother. Of course, the vast majority of medieval women left no written records of their experiences of pregnancy, birth, and motherhood. But by piecing together clues from medical texts, religious writings, art and archaeology, scholars have been able to paint a fascinating picture of what these processes were like for women at different levels of society. For women of the nobility, pregnancy and childbirth were shaped by their dynastic duties to produce heirs. Royal mothers were often attended by the best doctors and midwives, but they also faced intense pressure and scrutiny. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in any medieval woman's life, but for queens and princesses, the stakes were especially high. One of the most famous royal mothers of the Middle Ages was Blanche of Castile, who lived in the 13th century. Blanche was the daughter of King Alfonso VIII of Castile and Queen Eleanor of England. At the age of 12, she was sent to France to marry Prince Louis, who later became King Louis VIII. Over the course of her life, Blanche gave birth to 12 children. As a young bride, she was said to be very anxious about the dangers of childbirth. According to one chronicle, she asked her husband to pray that she would die before having to endure it. Despite her fears, Blanche survived her many pregnancies and labours, though several of her children died young, a sadly common occurrence in medieval times. When Louis VIII died after a short reign, Blanche's 12-year-old son ascended the throne as Louis IX, with Blanche as regent. She proved to be a formidable ruler and a devoted mother, fiercely protecting her son's interests. Blanche was deeply pious and passed on her strong faith to Louis, who went on to become a canonized saint. The story of Blanche of Castile is a powerful example of how medieval queenship was inextricably tied to motherhood. Royal women were expected to produce heirs and often judged on their fertility. At the same time, childbearing could give queens influence and agency as mothers of kings. Blanche wielded significant political power, but it was her role as the mother of the king that gave her the authority to do so. For women lower down the social ladder, pregnancy and childbirth looked quite different than it did for royalty, but no less momentous and risky. Peasant women often worked right up until their due dates and might give birth in the fields or in a barn with only a midwife or female relative to assist them. The lying-in period was a luxury many could not afford, as they had to resume their labours as soon as possible. Despite the many hardships they faced, medieval mothers showed incredible resilience and strength. They drew on the wisdom and support of their female communities, from midwives to relatives to religious sisters, to guide them through the joys and perils of bearing children. Though many of their individual stories are lost to time, we can still feel a sense of connection to these women of the past. They faced some of the same fears, pains, and transformations that mothers still grapple with today. Learning about their experiences enriches our understanding of the long and complex history of women's reproductive lives. So as we come to the end of our journey through medieval pregnancy, birth, and motherhood, let's take a moment to honor the unnamed multitudes of women who brought forth life in an age before modern medicine. They approached these mysteries armed only with faith, herbal wisdom, and the strength they drew from each other. Though the context has greatly changed from the medieval birthing chamber to the modern delivery room, that profound sense of women supporting each other through the thresholds of fear and suffering into new life endures across the ages. The stories we've shared, from Hildegard of Bingen's revolutionary medical texts to Marjorie Kempe's searing memories of postpartum despair, offer us precious glimpses into this often hidden world of medieval women's experiences. By grappling with how birth and mothering looked in the past, in all its beauty and brutality, we can cultivate a deeper sense of empathy and awe for this fundamental human drama that transcends any one moment in history. It's a reminder of how women have always found ways to survive, to care for each other, and to carry on the great work of bringing new life into an uncertain world. So as we drift off to sleep, let's hold these medieval mothers in our hearts and in our dreams. May we honor their struggles, celebrate their joys, and be inspired by their enduring courage. And may we remember that no matter the time or place, the act of giving birth unites women in an ancient sisterhood, forever linking the past, the present, and the future in one great, unbroken chain of life. As we've seen, pregnancy was a time of great uncertainty for medieval women. Without reliable contraception or prenatal care as we know it today, expectant mothers relied on a combination of folk wisdom, religious faith, and the support of other women to see them through the challenges ahead. One remarkable woman who embodied this resilience was Blanche of Castile, the 13th century Queen of France. Born into Spanish royalty in 1188, Blanche was renowned for her intelligence, piety, and political savvy. At the tender age of 12, she was wed to the future King Louis VIII of France and would go on to bear him 12 children over the course of their marriage. Blanche's first pregnancy came just a year after her wedding, when she was barely a teenager herself. In an age when noble marriages were made for political gain, early childbearing was the norm. But that didn't make it any less daunting for young women like Blanche. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was a perilous undertaking, with a maternal mortality rate estimated at up to 15%. Despite the risks, Blanche approached her royal duties with courage and aplomb. Over the next 2 decades, she would endure a dozen pregnancies and deliveries, ultimately giving birth to 6 sons and 6 daughters. While not all of her children would survive to adulthood, Blanche's fecundity was a source of pride and a testament to her fortitude. Of course, even a queen wasn't exempt from the discomforts and dangers of childbirth. Like all medieval mothers, Blanche would have relied on the wisdom of midwives to guide her through labour and delivery. These skilled women, often with years of practical experience, played a crucial role in assisting with births at every level of society. When a noblewoman like Blanche went into labour, her attendants would have sprung into action, preparing the birthing chamber with clean linens, heating water, and gathering supplies. Midwives might employ a variety of techniques to ease the mother's pain and speed the baby's arrival, from massaging her belly with oils to offering herbal teas and tinctures. As the contractions intensified, the midwife would monitor the baby's position and progress, coaching the mother through the pushing stage. If the labour was prolonged or difficult, assistants might be called in to help support the mother's body or apply gentle traction to the emerging infant. In some cases, midwives would resort to more drastic measures, like using hooks or forceps to extract a stuck baby, though such interventions carried serious risks in an age before germ theory or antibiotics. Childbirth was an intense physical ordeal, but it was also a profoundly spiritual experience for medieval women. Many labouring mothers called upon the Virgin Mary or St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, for strength and protection, reciting prayers and clutching holy relics as talismans against harm. The presence of supportive female companions was thought to have an almost sacred power, mirroring the way the Virgin was said to have been attended by midwives at the birth of Christ. If all went well, the ordeal of labour would culminate in a squalling newborn, and a new set of challenges for the exhausted mother. In our next section, we'll explore how medieval women navigated the postpartum period, from nursing and swaddling to the lying-in period of mandated rest. We'll also meet Marjorie Kempe, an English mystic whose vivid account of childbirth and its aftermath offers a rare glimpse into the embodied reality of motherhood in the Middle Ages. But first, let's take a moment to reflect on the story of Blanche of Castile, a woman who wielded immense power in a patriarchal society, even as her body was subjected to the inescapable risks and rigours of childbearing. Through a dozen pregnancies and births, Blanche demonstrated the remarkable resilience and strength that characterised so many medieval mothers. Her legacy is a testament to the enduring power of women's voices, bodies, and spirits in the face of unimaginable challenges. As we'll see in our final section, that legacy echoes down through the centuries. In the herbal lore passed from mother to daughter, in the whispered prayers of labouring women, and in the unbroken chain of midwives' hands, guiding new life into the world. So let us turn now to the moment of delivery and the age-old rituals that surrounded it in the medieval birthing chamber. The birth of a child was a momentous occasion in medieval society, marked by a flurry of activity and anticipation. As a labouring mother neared the final stages of delivery, her attendants would rally around her, offering both practical assistance and moral support. The midwife, as the most experienced and authoritative figure in the room, took charge of the proceedings with a calm and steady hand. With the mother positioned on a birthing stool or propped up in bed, the midwife would carefully monitor her progress, feeling for the baby's head and assessing its alignment. As the contractions reached a crescendo, she might offer words of encouragement or guide the mother's breathing, coaxing her through the intense sensations of crowning and expulsion. The moment of birth itself was a blur of activity and emotion. With a gush of amniotic fluid and a final triumphant push, the baby would emerge into the world, slick and squalling. The midwife would deftly catch the infant, cutting the umbilical cord with a sharpened blade and tying it off with thread. She might then hold the baby aloft for the mother to see, proclaiming its sex and remarking on any notable features. From there, the focus shifted to the delivery of the placenta, or afterbirth, a critical step in ensuring the mother's safety and recovery. The midwife would gently massage the mother's belly, encouraging the uterus to contract and expel the placental tissue. If the placenta was slow to detach or emerged only partially, the midwife might need to reach inside the birth canal to extract it manually, a delicate and potentially dangerous procedure. With the placenta delivered and the immediate danger past, the mood in the birthing chamber would shift to one of celebration and relief. The baby would be wiped clean and swaddled snugly in linen bands, then presented to the mother for nursing. The midwife, meanwhile, would assess the mother for any signs of excessive bleeding or infection, offering herbal remedies and physical support as needed. For noble and royal mothers like Blanche of Castile, the moments after birth were also a time of great ceremony and religious observance. A priest might be summoned to perform a baptism or blessing, while messengers were dispatched to spread news of the happy event throughout the land. The baby's father and other male relatives would be invited to visit the birthing chamber, paying their respects to the new arrival and offering congratulations to the mother. But even in the midst of all this activity, there was an understanding that the real work of motherhood was only just beginning. In the weeks and months ahead, the new mother would face a host of challenges, from the physical demands of breastfeeding and recovery to the emotional toll of caring for a helpless infant. She would rely on the support of her female kin and community to navigate this new landscape, drawing strength from their shared wisdom and experience. And so we come to the story of Marjorie Kempe, a woman whose postpartum struggles offer a poignant glimpse into the realities of medieval motherhood. Born in England in the late 14th century, Marjorie was a deeply devout woman who experienced a spiritual awakening after the difficult birth of her first child. In her autobiographical book of Marjorie Kempe, she describes the anguish and despair she felt in the weeks following her delivery as she grappled with the overwhelming demands of motherhood and the loss of her former identity. "I was laboured with great accesses," Marjorie writes, describing the fits of weeping and despair that gripped her in the postpartum period. "I would have killed myself many a time as they lasted, and was always kept from it by the grace of God." Marjorie's account is a rare and powerful testament to the emotional upheaval of new motherhood and the way it could challenge even the most devout and determined of medieval women. Like so many mothers before and since, she struggled to reconcile the joys and wonders of her new baby with the profound sense of loss and alienation that accompanied the transition to motherhood. But Marjorie's story is also one of resilience and transformation. Through her deep faith and the support of her community, she found the strength to embrace her new role as a mother and a mystic, channeling her experiences into a life of spiritual devotion and service. Her book stands as a monument to the power of women's voices and the enduring legacy of medieval motherhood, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always the possibility of grace and redemption. As we come to the end of our journey through the history of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth in the Middle Ages, it's worth reflecting on the ways in which these experiences have shaped the lives of women across time and culture. From the superstitions and taboos surrounding menstrual blood to the perils and triumphs of childbirth, the embodied realities of womanhood have always been a source of both fascination and fear, wonder and awe. Yet what strikes me most about the stories we've heard today is the remarkable resilience and strength of medieval women in the face of these challenges. Without the benefit of modern medicine or technology, they found ways to manage their monthly cycles, navigate the uncertainties of pregnancy, and bring new life into the world with courage and grace. They drew on the wisdom of their foremothers and the support of their sisters, creating networks of care and knowledge that sustained them through the most difficult of times. And in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to inspire and inform us today. From the herbal lore of medieval midwives to the spiritual practices of visionary mystics like Marjorie Kempe, the knowledge and traditions of medieval womanhood have been passed down through generations, shaping the way we understand and experience our own bodies and lives. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us hold these stories in our hearts, not just as curious remnants of a distant past, but as a reminder of the timeless strength and wisdom of women's bodies and minds. Let us honor the legacy of our foremothers by continuing to share our own stories, to support and care for one another, and to trust in the power of our own embodied knowledge. And let us dream of a future in which all women, everywhere, can experience the joys and challenges of their reproductive lives with the same sense of awe, wonder, and grace as the women of the Middle Ages. As we've seen, medieval women faced many challenges and dangers in their reproductive lives, from the onset of menstruation through pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum recovery. Yet they also drew upon rich veins of knowledge, passed down through generations of mothers, midwives, and wise women. One remarkable figure who exemplifies this tradition is Saint Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German Benedictine abbess. Though Hildegard is best known today for her soaring musical compositions and mystical religious visions, she was also a keen observer of the natural world and the human body. In her medical texts, Causae et Curae and Physica, Hildegard offered a holistic perspective on women's health that was centuries ahead of its time. Hildegard recognized that menstruation was a natural cleansing process, not a curse or a sign of impurity as many believed. She advised women to let their monthly flow complete its course without attempting to suppress it. At a time when many doctors recommended bloodletting as a cure-all, Hildegard cautioned against this practice for menstruating women, noting that it could weaken the body at an already vulnerable time. She also understood the importance of nutrition for women's reproductive health. Hildegard described foods that could help regulate the menstrual cycle, ease cramps and bloating, and promote fertility. She recommended soothing herbs like mugwort and motherwort to relax the womb, and iron-rich greens to replenish the blood. It's likely that Hildegard gained much of this practical knowledge from the oral traditions of midwives and herbal healers. In her writings, she recognized the expertise of these wise women and sought to preserve their insights. Hildegard encouraged abbesses like herself to learn about women's medicine so they could better care for their fellow sisters. As a religious leader, Hildegard also offered spiritual counsel to women in all stages of life. She believed that while the trials of womanhood could bring great suffering, they could also be a path to holiness and communion with the divine. For a woman struggling through a difficult pregnancy or labor, Hildegard prescribed prayers and meditations to calm the mind and entrust the body to God's will. Hildegard's medical writings were shaped by her view of the human body as a microcosm of the natural world, intimately connected to the rhythms of the seasons and the elements. She saw menstruation, conception and birth not as shameful or unclean, but as sacred mysteries that reflected the generative powers of the earth itself. This reverence for the female body was not always shared by medieval men, especially those in the church hierarchy. Some clergymen preached that the pain of childbirth was Eve's curse, a fitting punishment for the original sin. Others spread superstitious fears about the dangerous powers of menstrual blood. But for many ordinary people, the practical wisdom of women like Hildegard held more sway than abstract theology. Mothers, grandmothers, sisters and aunts passed down knowledge about how to manage periods with absorbent mosses and rags, how to ease morning sickness with ginger root and peppermint, how to coax a stubborn baby from the womb with gentle massage and squatting positions. These practices varied somewhat by region and social class. A noble woman might have a dedicated lying-in chamber and a staff of servants to tend to her as she recuperated from childbirth. A peasant mother was more likely to give birth in a barn or a hut, with only her female kin to help her. But rich or poor, young or old, medieval women depended on the support and skills of their sisters in these transformative moments. Of course, no amount of skill could eliminate the dangers of childbirth in an era before modern medicine. Complications like breech births, prolonged labor, and postpartum infection claimed the lives of many mothers and babies. Caesarean sections were known but rarely survived. Fistulas and prolapsed uteruses were common and untreatable. The spectre of death hovered over every pregnancy and delivery. Perhaps that is why the women who successfully birthed a large family were so revered. Blanche of Castile, the 13th century Queen of France, was hailed as a paragon of motherhood for delivering 12 children, including the future Saint Louis. The fact that at least 5 of those children died young did not diminish her stature. It was simply the reality of medieval childhood. For aristocratic women like Blanche, motherhood was also a political imperative, the key to securing dynastic continuity. A queen who failed to produce an heir could be cast aside, or even executed, as Henry VIII would prove centuries later. The pressure to conceive and carry a healthy pregnancy was immense. Interestingly, medieval noblewomen often enjoyed a respite from this pressure during their lying-in period. After giving birth, a new mother was expected to rest in seclusion for up to a month, attended only by female companions. This time of bonding with her baby and recovering her strength was a rare break from the demands of public life. In some ways, the lying-in period reflected the wisdom of Hildegard and other women healers, who understood that rest and good nutrition were essential for postpartum recovery. The practice also gave mothers a chance to establish breastfeeding, which was strongly encouraged by medieval doctors and midwives. However, the lying-in month could also be a time of isolation and anxiety, especially for women who struggled with the physical and emotional challenges of new motherhood. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, wrote movingly about her distress after a difficult first birth left her feeling hopeless and alone. In her spiritual autobiography, Kempe described how she was tormented by disturbing visions and thoughts of self-harm. To the modern reader, Kempe's symptoms sound like a clear case of postpartum depression. But in the medieval world, mental illness was often viewed through a religious lens. Some believed that Kempe's anguish was a sign of demonic possession or divine punishment for her sins. It took a visitation from Jesus Christ himself, Kempe said, to restore her sanity and set her on the path to sainthood. Kempe's story is a poignant reminder of how far we have come in understanding women's health and how far we still have to go. Today, we know that postpartum depression is a common and treatable condition, not a moral failing. We have safer and more effective methods of contraception, prenatal care, and pain relief in childbirth. But we also live in a world where many women still lack access to basic reproductive health care, where maternal mortality rates remain shockingly high in some communities. As we reflect on the lives of medieval women, we can marvel at their resilience in the face of unimaginable challenges. We can honor the knowledge and compassion of healers like Hildegard, who saw the female body as a sacred vessel deserving of care and respect. And we can recommit ourselves to the ongoing fight for reproductive justice, so that all women can experience the joys and trials of womanhood with dignity and support. For though the medieval world may seem distant from our own, the essential experiences of menstruation, pregnancy, and birth remain unchanged. These are the great equalizers, the ties that bind us to our foremothers across the centuries. In learning their stories, we better understand our own, and we can draw strength from the wisdom and grace that they embodied in the face of adversity. So let us give thanks for the midwives and mothers, the saints and sinners, the queens and peasants who endured the pains and triumphs of womanhood long before our time. Let us remember them as we drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that we are part of an ancient and enduring sisterhood. And let us dream of a future where every woman can live and give birth in safety, joy, and loving companionship. As we've seen, pregnancy and childbirth were perilous times for medieval women. Without modern obstetric care, complications that would be considered relatively minor today could quickly become life-threatening. It's estimated that around 1 in 50 births resulted in the mother's death during this period. One of the most famous examples of the dangers of medieval childbirth is the story of Queen Jane Seymour, third wife of England's King Henry VIII. In October 1537, after a long and difficult labour, Jane finally gave birth to a son, Prince Edward. The whole country rejoiced at the arrival of a male heir. Henry was overjoyed and reportedly wept tears of happiness as he cradled his newborn son. But just a few days later, Jane's condition took a turn for the worse. She developed a severe postpartum infection, likely childbed fever. This was a common killer of new mothers, spread by the unwashed hands of midwives and physicians. Despite the best efforts of her doctors, Jane's fever raged out of control. she slipped in and out of consciousness as her body weakened. On the 12th night after Edward's birth, Jane spoke her last words, "I am not well," before falling into a coma. She died quietly in the early hours of October 24th, 1537, just shy of her 29th birthday. Henry was devastated by the loss of his entirely beloved queen. As one courtier noted, there was great sorrow and lamentation at the death of the queen, for she was highly esteemed for her goodness. Jane's story, while tragic, was all too common in her time. Even women who survived the initial ordeal of giving birth faced many postpartum challenges and risks. Infection was a constant threat in the days before antiseptic practices. Heavy bleeding or postpartum hemorrhage could also endanger the mother's life. To ward off these dangers, medieval people employed various rituals and remedies. New mothers were confined to bed for an extended period of lying in, generally about 3 to 4 weeks, to rest and recover. During this time, female family members and attendants took charge of all the new mother's needs. They prepared special foods thought to promote healing and lactation, like caudle, a warm drink made from thin gruel, egg yolks, sugar, and spices. Lying in also protected the new mother and baby from the many spiritual threats medieval people feared, like malevolent fairies snatching the baby or the evil eye causing harm. The lying in period served an important social function too. It created a space for the new mother to adjust to the demands of parenthood, surrounded by a supportive community of women. Childbirth was a rite of passage that forged strong bonds between generations. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and midwives all had a role to play in shepherding a new mother through those tender postpartum days. Once the lying-in period ended, mothers still took great care to protect their vulnerable newborns. Babies were generally kept in swaddling bands for the first few months of life. Swaddling served several purposes. It was thought to keep the baby warm, support their limbs, and prevent them from scratching themselves. Swaddled babies were also easier to carry and keep track of while mothers went about their daily work. However, swaddling fell out of favour in later centuries due to concerns about restricting movement and the risk of loose bands covering the baby's face. Breastfeeding was the norm in the medieval period, as it had been throughout most of human history. Almost all infants were breastfed, either by their own mothers or by a wet nurse if the mother had died or could not produce enough milk herself. Nursing generally continued for at least a year, and often longer. Beliefs around breastfeeding could sometimes conflict with religious practices. The medieval church taught that intercourse was forbidden on Sundays and all major holy days. Some religious authorities also argued that the bodily fluids involved in intercourse would contaminate the milk of a nursing mother. This left breastfeeding mothers in a quandary, caught between the physical needs of their infants and spiritual demands. As medical knowledge began to progress in the later Middle Ages, writers started to include more practical breastfeeding advice in their health manuals. The 14th century Italian physician Paolo Bagelardo, for example, instructed nursing mothers to eat a nutritious diet, avoid strong emotions, and allow the baby to feed on demand. All ideas that align well with modern practices. While we may look back on some medieval childbirth and parenting practices with a critical eye, it's clear that women of the time demonstrated great strength and resilience. They made the best of the knowledge and resources they had to carry on the age-old work of birthing and nurturing the next generation. The bonds between mothers, midwives, and other women ensured that knowledge of pregnancy and postpartum care was preserved and passed down, even in the absence of formal medical training. At a time when the writings of male physicians often neglected women's embodied experiences, this oral tradition was a vital source of support. As medical science has advanced over the centuries, practices around childbirth and women's health have continuously evolved. In some cases, traditional knowledge that was dismissed by male-dominated medicine has been reclaimed and validated, as with the benefits of upright birthing positions and immediate skin-to-skin contact between mother and newborn. The story of pregnancy and birth in the medieval period reminds us of both how far we've come and how much we still have to learn. It invites us to reflect on the unbroken chain of women supporting women through one of life's most transformative journeys. Though the Middle Ages can feel impossibly distant to us now, the love, fear, joy, and sorrow of bringing new life into the world are human experiences that transcend time. The voices of medieval mothers may be lost to history, but their legacy endures in the resilience and wisdom of women across centuries. As we face the challenges of modern parenthood, we can draw strength from their stories of courage in the face of adversity. And as we work to improve care and support for birthing people worldwide, we honor the generations of women who came before us, armed with nothing more than the knowledge in their bones and the love in their hearts. Let's continue our journey through the intimate lives of medieval women by turning our attention to the postpartum period, those precarious first days and weeks after a baby was born. In a time long before the conveniences of modern medical care, the support of other women was absolutely essential to the survival of both mother and child. Imagine the scene: a darkened birthing chamber, illuminated by flickering candlelight. The new mother lies exhausted on a straw pallet, her body still coursing with the aftershocks of delivery. The midwife and female attendants bustle around her, washing the vernix-covered newborn in a basin of warm water. One of the first priorities was to swaddle the infant tightly in linen strips, binding the arms and legs close to the body. This age-old practice was believed to calm the baby and ensure proper limb growth. The child would then be handed to the mother to initiate breastfeeding, a crucial moment of bonding and nourishment. However, attitudes towards that initial breast milk, the colostrum, varied greatly in medieval times. Some cultures, like the ancient Egyptians, revered this nutrient-rich substance as a sacred elixir. The Talmud, a central text of Judaism, also spoke positively of giving babies colostrum. But in medieval Europe, colostrum was often regarded with suspicion. The thick, yellowish fluid was so different from the whitish breast milk that followed, many believed it to be unhealthy or even dangerous for the child. As a result, some medieval mothers were encouraged to express and discard their colostrum, depriving their babies of vital antibodies and immunity-boosting properties. For a fascinating glimpse into the lived experience of a medieval mother, we turn to the story of Margery Kempe. Born around 1373 in Norfolk, England, Margery was a middle-class housewife who became a renowned Christian mystic and author, dictating what's considered the first autobiography in the English language. In her book, Margery vividly recounted the trauma of her first childbirth at age 20. After a long and difficult labour, she delivered a boy, but quickly developed a postpartum infection, suffering from fevers and painful breast abscesses. In her weakened physical and mental state, Margery became tormented by terrible visions and fell into what we would now recognise as severe postpartum depression. For many months, she grappled with feelings of intense despair, guilt, and religious terror. With the support of her patient husband and faith community, Margery gradually recovered. But her searing account of postpartum psychosis echoes through the centuries, reminding us that the mental health challenges faced by new mothers are nothing new. Luckily for medieval mothers, there was a built-in support system to help them through those fragile first weeks. The lying-in period was a standard part of postpartum care, a time of rest and seclusion, typically lasting 3 to 4 weeks, though some aristocratic mothers took 6 to 8 weeks to heal. During this time, the new mother was relieved of all work and household duties. She was expected to stay in bed, keep warm, and focus solely on regaining her strength and nursing her baby. Female relatives and neighbours played an essential role in this postpartum cocoon. They prepared nourishing foods like rich broths and ales, changed the bedding, and swaddled the infant. This tradition of social support was so important that women of all social classes participated. Even the poorest families tried to honour the lying-in period, knowing it could mean the difference between life and death for mother and child. As we reflect on these medieval birthing practices, what wisdom might we glean for our modern lives? In our technocentric age of hospitalized deliveries and isolated nuclear families, the postpartum period can be a time of intense vulnerability for new mothers. The medieval model of extended rest and community support holds powerful lessons for us. Perhaps by reviving some of these ancient traditions, honoring the sacred window of the fourth trimester, nourishing the new mother with loving care from female friends and relatives, valuing rest as much as we value productivity, we can help more mothers not only survive, but thrive as they adapt to the momentous identity shift of becoming a parent. The story of medieval women and their experiences of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth is one of resilience in the face of daunting odds. With limited medical knowledge and high rates of maternal mortality, these women leaned hard on the support of their sisters. The bonds forged in birthing chambers and during postpartum lying-in periods helped knit together the social fabric of female friendship and intergenerational wisdom. Even as our modern scientific understanding of women's health issues has advanced by leaps and bounds, we still have much to learn from our foremothers. By listening to their stories with open hearts and minds, we can find new wellsprings of insight relevant to our lives today. In honoring their struggles and triumphs, we honor the unbroken chain of women supporting women that stretches back centuries and will continue on into our future. So let us dream of a world where no woman has to face the challenges of menstruation, pregnancy, or postpartum alone. Let us imagine communities that uplift the embodied wisdom of women, providing the rest and care needed to thrive during life's most vulnerable transitions. And let us work to create that world. One mother, one child, one lying-in period at a time, knowing we're held in the loving arms of the women who came before us. The pain relief methods used during medieval childbirth were often rudimentary by today's standards, but they highlight the resourcefulness and wisdom of the women who attended births during this time. Midwives and female relatives drew upon centuries of passed-down knowledge to ease the labouring mother's discomfort and help the birth progress as smoothly as possible. One common practice was for the midwife to massage the mother's belly with oil or butter, which was thought to relax the muscles and soften the skin to prevent tearing. Some midwifery manuals also advised using a warm compress of herbs like mugwort or flaxseed placed on the mother's lower back or abdomen. The heat was said to soothe pain and encourage the baby to descend into the birth canal. Labouring mothers were also given herbal teas and tinctures to drink, made with ingredients believed to speed up contractions and dull pain. A popular recipe recorded in several medieval texts called for a mixture of ground ivy, vervain, and savin to be boiled in wine or ale and drunk throughout labour. Many of these herbs had mild analgesic or stimulant properties, though dosages were often imprecise and the effects variable. In some cases, midwives would manually dilate the cervix or rupture the amniotic sac if labour was slow to progress. These interventions came with a high risk of infection, as the importance of hand washing and sterile tools was not yet understood. But they reflect the pressure midwives faced to deliver a baby quickly, knowing that prolonged labour endangered both mother and child. Religion also played a key role in the medieval birthing chamber. Labouring mothers were encouraged to pray to the Virgin Mary and various female saints associated with childbirth, like St. Margaret of Antioch. Priests or male relatives would sometimes wait outside the door, offering blessings or reciting devotional prayers. Holy relics, blessed oils, and consecrated candles might be brought into the room with the hope of easing suffering and ensuring a safe delivery through divine intervention. But perhaps the most vital form of pain relief was the social support provided by the other women present at the birth. The midwife and female family members would offer soothing words of encouragement, hold the laboring mother's hand, and wipe her brow. At a time when childbirth was an exclusively female domain, this kind of hands-on emotional support was an essential part of the midwife's role. It's a reminder that while medical knowledge was limited, medieval people recognized the power of human compassion and community in helping women through the challenges of labor and delivery. The bonds forged between midwives, mothers, and their female relatives in the birthing chamber were a source of strength that helped them endure the pain and uncertainty of bringing new life into the world. Of course, even with these pain relief methods, the dangers of childbirth were still very real in the medieval period. Without access to emergency surgery or antibiotics, complications like obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or puerperal fever claimed the lives of many women. The exact maternal mortality rate is difficult to determine, as detailed records were not always kept, especially for the lower classes. But based on available data from aristocratic families and religious institutions, historians estimate that anywhere from 1% to 3% of births ended in the mother's death. To put that into perspective, a woman who gave birth to 5 children would have had around a 1 in 20 chance of dying from childbirth-related causes in her lifetime. These stark realities underscore just how perilous the act of giving birth was for medieval women, regardless of their social status. Even the most privileged had cause to fear death in childbed, as the story of Queen Jane Seymour tragically illustrates. The third wife of King Henry VIII, Jane endured a long and difficult labour to deliver the king's much-longed-for male heir, Prince Edward, in October 1537. By all accounts, mother and baby seemed to rally in the days following the birth. But after developing a postpartum infection, Jane's condition rapidly worsened. She died just 2 weeks later, at the age of 28. Another royal life, cut short by the travails of childbearing. Jane's story is a poignant reminder that not even wealth or status could fully protect a medieval woman from the mortal perils of the birthing bed. For all the joys of motherhood, the process of bringing forth a new life remained fraught with danger and uncertainty. Given these harsh realities, it's no wonder that pregnant women sought spiritual comfort and divine protection as their time drew near. Many would make pilgrimages to holy sites or shrines associated with safe delivery, offering prayers and votive gifts in the hopes of securing heavenly aid. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris housed a special relic known as the Girdle of the Virgin, said to be the very belt Mary wore during her pregnancy with Jesus. This sacred object was believed to possess miraculous powers to ease difficult labor when laid upon the belly of a woman in childbirth. Noble ladies from across Europe would undertake journeys to Paris to touch this holy relic and seek the Virgin's intercession for a safe delivery. Similarly, many churches kept special talismans known as birthing girdles, long strips of parchment or fabric inscribed with prayers and invocations to female saints. These would be loaned out or rented to pregnant parishioners, who would wear them wrapped around their waists in the final weeks before labor began as a form of divine protection and assistance. These spiritual rituals offered medieval mothers a sense of control and comfort in the face of so much uncertainty. They were a way to invoke the sacred feminine and draw upon a long lineage of holy mothers who had endured the trials of childbearing. Through these practices, women sought to channel divine strength and mercy as they faced down the pains and perils of bringing new souls into the world. So as the expectant mother labored on, breathing through each wave of contractions and fixing her mind on sacred images, her birth attendants stood ready to greet the new arrival with all the wisdom and skill at their disposal. The room would be thick with the mingled scents of burning candles, herbal infusions, and bodily fluids as they worked together to usher the baby forth from the womb and into waiting hands. The moment of delivery was a sacred threshold, the liminal space between worlds where life and death hung in the balance. The first cry of the newborn piercing the air was a joyous sound, a sign that the ordeal was over and mother and child had survived. The midwife would then cut the umbilical cord, tying it off with linen thread before swaddling the infant and placing it skin to skin on the mother's chest. But the labor of childbirth was not yet complete. The delivery of the placenta, or afterbirth, was a crucial final stage that required careful monitoring. The midwife would massage the mother's belly to encourage the uterus to contract and expel the placenta naturally. If it did not emerge promptly or in one piece, she might resort to more forceful means of extraction, introducing a grave risk of hemorrhage or inversion of the womb. Sometimes, in cases of extreme maternal distress or death, a midwife or surgeon would have to cut into the womb to remove the baby in a desperate bid to save its life or ensure it was baptized before it perished. Such emergency cesarean sections were a vanishingly rare occurrence and almost always fatal for the mother. The medical knowledge and techniques to safely perform this surgery simply did not exist in the medieval era. Thankfully, for most labors that progressed without major complication, the expulsion of the afterbirth marked the completion of the birth process. The new mother would be washed and dressed in fresh linens, her abdomen bound tightly with swaddling bands in the belief that this would help the womb shrink back to its original size. The physical and emotional intensity of labor now gave way to a period of joyful but anxious celebration. After many months of waiting and preparation, the child had finally arrived, a new soul to welcome into the family and community. But the first few days of an infant's life were still a precarious time, as many babies fell victim to infection, dehydration, or other ills before their mother's first milk came in. To protect the vulnerable newborn, medieval families employed a variety of ritual practices believed to ward off evil spirits and ensure the baby's survival. Placing an open pair of iron scissors or a needle under the crib was thought to keep fairies from stealing the child and replacing it with a sickly changeling. A coin, key, or other charms might be tucked into the swaddling bands as protective talismans. The baptism of the infant was considered a vital safeguard for its eternal soul, and was usually performed as soon as possible after birth, sometimes within hours. In an era of high infant mortality, the urgency to cleanse the baby of original sin and give it a Christian name was felt most keenly. To die unbaptized was to be denied entry into heaven, a fate no parent wanted to risk for their child. So even as the exhausted new mother rested and recovered from her exertions, preparations for the christening would be well underway. Godparents would be chosen, holy water collected, and the baby dressed in a special white gown symbolizing purity and new life. The baptismal ceremony marked the child's entrance into the spiritual community of the church, just as its birth had marked its entrance into the earthly community of its family. For the mother, the work of childbirth was far from over. Even if she had survived the dangers of delivery, the postpartum period presented its own challenges and risks. Infection was a constant spectre, as the lochia, the bloody discharge from the womb, left the new mother vulnerable to deadly puerperal fever. To guard against this, midwives advised a period of strict confinement and rest known as the lying in. For a period of 3 to 4 weeks after delivery, the new mother was to remain in bed, waited on by female relatives and attendants. She was to avoid cold drafts, eat warm and nourishing foods like chicken soup or ale posset, and abstain from sexual activity. This period of seclusion served both physical and social purposes. It allowed the mother time to heal and bond with her newborn, establish breastfeeding, and adjust to the demands of motherhood. But it also served to separate her from the public sphere during a time when she was considered spiritually and physically vulnerable. The book of Leviticus in the Bible prescribed a period of purification for postpartum women, deeming them unclean for a certain number of days depending on the sex of the child, 40 for a boy and 80 for a girl. While not all medieval Christians strictly observed these rules, the concept of the postpartum woman as somehow tainted or impure still lingered in the popular imagination. As such, the lying-in period was a time of liminality when the new mother existed in a space apart, not yet fully reintegrated into the rhythms and roles of her normal life. She was attended by a select group of female caregivers, her midwife, her mother or mother-in-law, perhaps a nursemaid or trusted servant. These women would help her navigate the physical and emotional challenges of early motherhood, offering guidance on breastfeeding, infant care, and recovery from childbirth. The care and nourishment of the postpartum mother was seen as vital to her successful recuperation and ability to nurse her child. Foods thought to promote lactation and restore vitality, like barley gruel, wine cordial, and rich meat broths, were prescribed. Herbal infusions of fennel, anise, and borage were drunk to increase milk flow and soothe digestive discomfort. But for all the focus on the new mother's diet and rest, the emotional and psychological impact of childbirth was often overlooked in medieval prescriptive texts. The hormonal shifts, sleep deprivation, and overwhelming responsibility of caring for a newborn could take a heavy toll, leading some women to experience what we would now recognize as postpartum depression or anxiety. These struggles often went unnamed and unacknowledged in medieval medical discourse, which tended to focus on the physical rather than mental health of postpartum women. But that does not mean that new mothers did not experience these challenges, or that their stories went entirely unrecorded. One remarkable example is the 15th century English mystic Margery Kempe, whose spiritual autobiography provides a rare first-hand account of the difficulties of medieval motherhood. Margery's memoirs, dictated to a scribe, describe her agonizing first childbirth at the age of 20 and the debilitating postpartum depression that followed. She writes of being out of her mind and tormented by intrusive thoughts and visions, unable to find joy in her new role as a mother. For months, Margery grappled with feelings of guilt, despair, and religious doubt. It was only after experiencing a spiritual epiphany and dedicating herself to a life of devout faith that she began to recover. While Margery's account is extraordinary in its candor and detail, it hints at the hidden struggles of countless medieval mothers whose stories have been lost to history. The transition to parenthood has always been a momentous and challenging one, shaped by the physical, social, and emotional realities of the time. For medieval women, the experiences of pregnancy, childbirth, and the postpartum period were colored by a complex web of religious beliefs, medical theories, and cultural practices. The female body was a site of both power and vulnerability, a conduit for the sacred act of creation, but also subject to the pain, danger, and mystery of the reproductive process. In a world where reliable contraception was non-existent and maternal mortality was high, women had little control over their fertility or their fate in childbirth. The looming spectre of death in the birthing bed was a constant one, and the grief of losing a child or a mother in labor a tragically common experience. And yet, even in the face of these harsh realities, medieval mothers and their midwives found ways to assert agency, share knowledge, and support one another through the transformative journey of childbearing. The birthing chamber was a space of female solidarity and skill, where women drew on centuries of embodied wisdom to usher new life into the world. The practices they developed may seem foreign or even misguided to modern eyes, shaped as they were by the limited medical understanding of the time. But they reflect a deep respect for the power and sanctity of women's reproductive capacities, and a recognition of childbirth as a profound spiritual and social event. In a time when the birthing process was shrouded in secrecy and superstition, midwives and mothers created rituals and communities of care that honored the sacredness of their shared experiences. From the use of holy relics and herbal remedies, to the guiding hands and soothing words of female birth attendants, these practices offered comfort, protection, and a sense of continuity in the face of the great unknown. Today, as we benefit from the incredible advances of modern medicine and the hard-won reproductive rights of women, it is easy to look back on the childbearing experiences of our medieval foremothers with a sense of relief or even pity. But there is also much we can learn from their resilience, their resourcefulness, and their reverence for the transformative power of birth. In a world where the medicalization of pregnancy and childbirth has in some ways disconnected us from the embodied wisdom and intuitive knowing of our female ancestors, we may well find value in reclaiming some of the traditions and mindsets that sustained them through the challenges of motherhood. The communal care and support of other women during labor and the postpartum period, the use of nourishing foods and gentle bodywork to aid in recovery, the acknowledgement of the spiritual and emotional dimensions of childbearing. These are all practices that still resonate today, even as we adapt them to our modern contexts. Most of all, the stories of medieval mothers remind us of the enduring strength and courage of women throughout history, who have faced the profound joys and sacrifices of childbearing with grace, grit, and an unwavering love for the new lives they bring forth. Their experiences may be distant from our own in time and circumstance, but they speak to the timeless human drama of reproduction, the awe and the agony of participating in the great cycle of life and death and rebirth. In honoring their journeys, we honor the sacred feminine power that flows through us all, connecting us across the centuries in the eternal dance of creation. So let us remember these women, our foremothers, as we navigate our own paths through the transformative terrain of fertility and motherhood. Let us draw strength from their stories and wisdom from their ways, even as we chart new courses for ourselves and our daughters. And let us never forget the profound courage and sacrifice that has always been required to bring forth new life, to nurture it and sustain it in an uncertain world. For in the end, the journey from maidenhood to motherhood is one that connects us all, a great and holy mystery that unfolds anew with every child born, every new soul welcomed into the waiting arms of the world. Let's turn now to the remarkable life of Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby. Born in 1441, Margaret was the daughter and sole heir of the wealthy John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset. As was common for noble girls at the time, she was betrothed at a young age to John de la Pole. However, this marriage agreement was broken so that King Henry VI could grant Margaret's hand to his loyal half-brother, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. At just 12 years old, Margaret found herself married and sent to live with her adult husband in Wales. It was an experience that must have been frightening and isolating for a young girl, far from home and shouldering the pressures of her family's ambitions. Within a year, Margaret conceived a child with Edmund, but her young body was hardly ready for the rigours of childbirth. In the autumn of 1456, 13-year-old Margaret went into a long and excruciating labour at Pembroke Castle. For hours, she struggled and strained to deliver the baby, hovering between life and death. The ordeal permanently damaged her reproductive organs, leaving her unable to bear any more children. But against the odds, both Margaret and her infant son survived. She would name him Henry, after the king. Tragically, the difficult birth left Margaret a widow, as Edmund Tudor had succumbed to plague just a few months earlier. So before her 14th birthday, Margaret was already a mother and grieving the loss of her first husband. It would have been understandable for her to retreat into a quiet life. But Margaret was made of stronger stuff. She would defy all expectations to become one of the most influential women of the Tudor dynasty. As a teenaged mother, Margaret devoted herself to her son Henry's care and upbringing. Even after remarrying, she ensured that Henry received a top-notch classical education, preparing him for his future role. A woman of deep piety, Margaret instilled in Henry a strong faith and sense of virtue, which would guide his later rule. Through clever maneuvering and strategic support of her son's allies, Margaret helped engineer Henry's rise to become the first Tudor King of England, Henry VII, after his victory in the Wars of the Roses. As the king's mother, Margaret became an influential force at court, intimately involved in matters of state. She served as a mentor and model of queenly comportment to her daughter-in-law Elizabeth of York. Margaret's personal spiritual devotion also shaped her public works. She was a prolific patron of religious houses and scholarship. Margaret established the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity at Oxford and Cambridge, funding education and the new art of printing. In her 60s, she even commissioned her own translation of the French romance, The Book of the Knight of the Tower, into English to make it more widely accessible, especially to young women. The indomitable Margaret Beaufort lived to see her grandson, Henry VIII, ascend the throne in 1509. She passed away just 2 months later at the age of 66, leaving behind an incredible legacy. From an uncertain childhood, she had weathered treacherous times to become a queen in all but name, the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty and one of medieval England's most fascinating mothers. Her story reminds us of the quiet strength of medieval women who shaped history even as they endured its most intimate trials. Margaret's difficult experience of childbirth at such a young age was all too common in medieval times, when girls were considered women from the age of 12 and contracted into marriages with little say in the matter. The perils of early pregnancy were compounded by the limited medical knowledge of the time. While midwives did their best to assist labouring mothers, pain relief was rudimentary at best. Herbal mixtures might be administered in an attempt to speed up delivery or ease suffering. Certain gemstones like agate were believed to have calming properties and were placed on the mother's belly. Prayers and charms invoking the Virgin Mary or saints associated with childbirth, like Saint Margaret of Antioch, were recited in hopes of divine intervention. But ultimately, birth was largely a waiting game that relied on nature taking its course. Prolonged labour, like what Margaret Beaufort endured for hours, could lead to life-threatening complications like eclampsia or fistulas for the mother. It could also put the baby at risk of oxygen deprivation or getting stuck in the birth canal. If labour stalled completely, a medieval midwife's last resort would be to manually rotate the baby into a deliverable position, or use hooks and other rudimentary surgical instruments to extract it, often with fatal consequences. Faced with these dangers, it's incredible that any medieval mothers and babies survived difficult births at all. Noble women often wrote their wills and put their affairs in order as they approached their due dates, understanding the very real chance that they might not live through the delivery. Yet even in the face of these harrowing odds, women like Margaret Beaufort showed a fierce will to survive and protect their children at all costs. Their stories of fortitude in the face of adversity still resonate through the centuries. For even the most privileged medieval mother, the process of childbirth was marked by uncertainty, pain, and peril. Without access to reliable contraception, women often had little control over their fertility. The average medieval woman spent much of her abbreviated adult life pregnant, nursing infants, or recovering from the physical toll of nearly annual births. But out of necessity and in the spirit of sisterhood, women banded together to support each other through these unavoidable challenges. The lying-in period after delivery, for example, represented more than just a time for physical recovery. It created a protected space where a new mother could adjust to the monumental changes in her body, bond with her baby, and receive wisdom from more experienced women. even in an era of strict social hierarchies, childbirth was a great equalizer, as women of all classes relied on each other in this time of vulnerability. Female friends and relatives gathered in the birthing chamber to provide comfort and encouragement to the laboring mother. They brought food and drink, massaged her back, held her hand, and coached her through the waves of contractions. After delivery, they helped with the crucial tasks of washing the baby, swaddling it tightly in strips of cloth to calm and contain the limbs, and facilitating that first latch of breastfeeding. The midwife oversaw this intimate process, administering herb-infused baths and belly binding to help the mother's body heal. As important as the physical support was the sense of camaraderie and continuity these rituals provided. Mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends shared stories and advice rooted in personal experience rather than abstract medical theories. Songs and prayers that had been passed down for generations wove the new mother into a rich tapestry of women's wisdom. Though they lived in a male-dominated world, within the lying-in chamber, women could momentarily create their own separate sphere of knowledge and kinship. In some ways, we can see this as a subversion of the era's rigid gender norms, a quiet claiming of power in the one arena where women's authority was unquestioned. By controlling the mysterious process of birth, medieval women carved out a rare space for themselves and their embodied experiences. Though they might return to lives of duty and submission as soon as they rose from the lying in bed, for a few weeks, they could revel in the primal power of what their incredible female bodies were capable of. The story of childbirth in the Middle Ages, then, is the story of women supporting women with compassion, grit, and ingenuity in the face of formidable odds. Though these experiences were marked by much suffering, there are still kernels of wisdom we can glean from their practices to ease the transition into motherhood. The importance of social support, of trusting the intuitive knowledge that arises from women's shared experiences, of making space for rest and recovery. These are insights that feel just as relevant today as they did centuries ago. As we drift off to sleep, perhaps we can dream of a world where all new mothers have access to the care and support they need to not just survive, but thrive as they undertake the profound journey of bringing new life into the world. A world where the legacy of our foremothers' strength and sacrifice is honored in truly valuing women's health and choices. In tending to this vision, we keep the flame of their fortitude alive. Let's shift our focus now to the remarkable figure of Margaret Beaufort, whose life story vividly illustrates the realities and risks of pregnancy and childbirth in medieval times. Born in 1443 to a noble family, Margaret was just a child herself when she was married at the tender age of 12 to the king's half-brother, Edmund Tudor. At 13, barely on the cusp of puberty, Margaret became pregnant with their first child. It's difficult for us to imagine the terror and uncertainty she must have felt as her belly swelled, her young body struggling to cope with the demands of growing new life. In an age without reliable contraception, it was not uncommon for girls to find themselves mothers before they had truly left childhood behind. Margaret would have been seen as a vessel for the Tudor lineage, her health and well-being secondary to the delivery of a male heir. As her pregnancy progressed, Margaret likely adhered to the advice laid out in medieval health manuals. The popular 13th century text known as the Trotula, written for the famous medical school at Salerno, offered guidance believed to ensure a healthy pregnancy. Expectant mothers were cautioned to avoid exertion, excitement, and sudden movements, lest they upset the delicate balance of the womb. They were plied with rich foods thought to nourish the growing babe: red meat, dark wine, and spiced broths. Particular emphasis was placed on the mother's spiritual state. Many believed that gazing upon beautiful artwork and listening to pleasant music would imprint those good qualities upon the unborn child. Conversely, it was feared that a pregnant woman witnessing an ugly sight or experiencing a fright could deform the baby or mark them with a birthmark. Margaret, a deeply devout young woman, surely spent many long hours in prayer, calling upon the saints and the Virgin Mary to watch over her and her precious burden. As her time drew near, Margaret would have retreated into seclusion, attended by a small coterie of midwives and female relatives. The birth chamber was a strictly feminine space, from which men were firmly excluded. Childbirth was dangerous, messy women's work. The medieval midwife, though skilled in folklore and herbal remedies passed down through generations, could do little against the very real threats of infection and hemorrhage that stalked the birthing bed. For a small, slight girl like Margaret, delivery must have been an agonizing ordeal. It was not unheard of for midwives to break the pubic bone of a particularly young mother to enable the baby's passage. Margaret labored for many excruciating hours, her attendants plying her with herbal concoctions and amulets to speed the process. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, she delivered a healthy baby boy. Named Henry after the king, this squalling infant would one day take the throne himself as the first Tudor monarch. Margaret's tiny frame was irreparably damaged by the birth. Though she went on to marry twice more and play a significant role in the Wars of the Roses, she never bore another child. In a world where a woman's worth was so intrinsically tied to the children she produced, Margaret turned her formidable intellect and drive to other purposes, masterminding her son's ascent and becoming one of the most powerful and influential women of her age. Margaret Beaufort's story, though extraordinary in many ways, would have been all too familiar to the women of medieval Europe. Their lives were shaped and circumscribed by the inescapable facts of their own biology. From the crimson tide of their first menses to the perils of the childbed, women's bodies were both the source of their strength and the root of their vulnerability. Let us turn now to the practices and rituals that sprung up around childbirth in medieval society. The delivery itself typically took place in the mother's bedchamber or in a specially prepared birthing room. The space would be hung with rich tapestries and the windows tightly shuttered to keep out draughts and prying eyes. A roaring fire in the grate ensured warmth, while clouds of frankincense and herb-infused steam sweetened the air. The mother-to-be was not expected to labor alone. She would be attended by a group of women, her mother, sisters, and friends, as well as the midwife and her assistants. These gossips, as they were known, derived from godsibs or close female companions, provided practical help and moral support, holding the laboring woman's hands, wiping her brow, and murmuring words of encouragement. The midwife took charge of the actual delivery, positioning the mother and guiding the baby into the world. Midwives were usually older women, their knowledge gained through apprenticeship and experience. While some came from medical families and possessed a degree of formal training, most midwives relied on traditional methods passed down from mother to daughter. To ease the pain of contractions, laboring women might be given wine or ale fortified with herbs like raspberry leaf and valerian root. Certain foods were thought to speed delivery, eel pie, for example, or butter melted in sweet wine. Amulets of coral, eagle stones, or lodestones were placed on the mother's belly or thighs to strengthen her and attract the baby earthside. As the birth progressed, the midwife might anoint the mother's swollen belly with oils or place a griddle cake upon it to encourage the baby to rise up like the dough. A medieval manual advises that if the woman holds the gem jasper in her right hand and it is enclosed in the fist, then it will come to birth immediately. Certain prayers and chants were recited, calling upon the Virgin Mary and various female saints associated with childbirth, like Saint Margaret the Virgin, who was said to have burst forth unharmed from the belly of a dragon. If labour stalled or the baby became stuck, more drastic measures might be employed. The mother could be bled to reduce inflammation or given an herbal purgative to empty her bowels and make more room for the baby. In extreme cases, the midwife might attempt to manually turn a breech baby or to cut the perineum to create a wider opening. Such interventions carried a high risk of infection and death for mother and child alike. Should the unthinkable happen and the baby fail to survive, unbaptized and thus consigned to limbo, a special ritual known as a chrism baptism could be performed. The midwife would wrap the tiny corpse in a white linen shroud and sprinkle it with holy water, reciting the words of the baptismal rite. This offered small comfort to the grieving parents, but ensured that the babe's soul would not be lost. If, however, the delivery was successful and the baby entered the world alive and whole, there was still a final hurdle to overcome: the delivery of the placenta, or afterbirth. Retained placenta was a leading cause of postpartum hemorrhage and maternal death. To guard against this, the cord might be cut only after the placenta had fully emerged, and the midwife would carefully inspect it to ensure no fragments remained within the womb. With the ordeal of labour finally over, the exhausted but elated new mother was washed, dressed in clean linens, and tucked into bed. The baby too was bathed, rubbed with salt and honey to ward off evil spirits, and swaddled tightly in linen strips. A small arrowhead or key might be tucked into the swaddling as a protective charm. For the next month or so, the new mother would observe a period of confinement known as her lying in. During this time, she was expected to rest and recuperate, attended by her gossips and female relatives. Her chamber would be kept warm and dimly lit, a womb-like cocoon in which she could regain her strength and bond with her newborn babe. Visitors, even close male relatives like her husband or father, were generally barred from the lying-in chamber. It was believed that the new mother was in a state of ritual impurity, her body still bleeding and leaking life-giving fluids. Exposure to the outside world was thought to put her in a spiritually and physically vulnerable state. Instead, the new mother was surrounded by her women, who took charge of running the household and caring for older children. They prepared special foods believed to aid in recovery and promote milk flow, like rich meat broths, barley gruel, and spiced wine. Herbal infusions of fennel, anise, and blessed thistle were given to soothe after pains and help the uterus contract back to its pre-pregnancy state. As the days passed and the new mother grew stronger, she might begin to venture from her bed to a daybed or chair, dressed in a warm robe and slippers. The baby was brought to her for frequent nursing, as colostrum, the thick yellowish fluid that preceded true breast milk, was rightly believed to give the child the best start in life. Wet nurses might be employed by wealthy families to spare the mother the physical toll of breastfeeding, but most medieval infants suckled at their own mother's breast for the first several months of life at least. Finally, after a month or so had passed, the new mother was deemed ready to rejoin the world. The culmination of her lying-in period was marked by a special ceremony known as the churching. Dressed in white and veiled, the woman was led to the church by her husband and a procession of female relatives. There, the priest blessed her and welcomed her back into the congregation, giving thanks for her survival and safe delivery. For medieval mothers, churching marked a return to the rhythms of daily life, to a world forever altered by the presence of a new soul. Though the risks and challenges they faced were immense, these women drew strength from the tight-knit bonds of sisterhood and the ancient wisdom passed down through generations of mothers, midwives, and healers. In a time when the mysteries of the female body were so little understood, they found ways to honor and celebrate the sacred cycles that defined their lives. The ebb and flow of blood, the swelling of new life, the raw power of bringing forth a child into the world. As we reflect on the experiences of medieval mothers from the vantage point of our modern world, it's easy to feel a sense of superiority, to marvel at how far we've come in terms of medical knowledge and women's rights. And yet, there is something deeply moving and powerful about the way these women banded together to support and care for one another through the most vulnerable and transformative moments of their lives. Perhaps there are lessons we can still learn from our foremothers about the importance of community, about trusting the wisdom of our own bodies, about the primal, elemental nature of birth itself. In a world that often seeks to medicalize and control the messy, unpredictable realities of womanhood, perhaps we could stand to reclaim some of that ancient feminine magic, to honor the sacred rhythms that have sustained us since time immemorial. From menarche to menopause, from quickening to crowning, the women of medieval Europe lived their lives in intimate communion with the mysteries of their own biology. Though their world was shaped by superstition and bounded by the limits of medicine, they found ways to imbue even the most mundane bodily functions with a sense of spiritual significance. In doing so, they left us a legacy of resilience, wisdom, and grace, one that echoes down through the ages to touch us even now, in the quiet moments when we confront the wonder and terror of our own embodied existence. As we've seen, pregnancy and childbirth were perilous times for medieval women. Without modern medicine and sanitation, complications could quickly turn deadly for both mother and child. Yet even in the face of these dangers, women found ways to claim power and agency over their reproductive lives. One remarkable example is the 15th century English mystic Margery Kempe. Born to a prosperous merchant family, Margery married at age 20 and soon became pregnant with her first child. But her labor was long and excruciating, lasting nearly 2 days. In her spiritual autobiography, The Book of Margery Kempe, she recounts crying out for deliverance, "Jesus, help me! Jesus, help me!" Finally, the baby arrived, but Margery's ordeal was far from over. Exhausted and weakened from the prolonged labor, she sank into a postpartum depression, plagued by disturbing visions and thoughts of self-harm. For months, Margery despaired, until she experienced a spiritual awakening that changed the course of her life. She went on to bear 13 more children, but also pursued a higher calling, making pilgrimages across Europe and the Holy Land. Margery Kempe's story speaks to the transformative power of childbirth, how the raw embodied experience could catalyze a woman's spiritual life and sense of purpose, even as it pushed her to the brink physically and emotionally. Her autobiography, dictated to scribes, stands as a rare record of a medieval woman's inner world, with all its struggles and triumphs. For most mothers, though, the focus was on more immediate, practical concerns in the tender postpartum period. The first priority was ensuring the survival of the newborn. Immediately after delivery, babies would be wiped clean of blood and vernix, the waxy white substance that coats their skin in the womb. The umbilical cord was cut using a sharp blade, then tied off or cauterized. Midwives had an arsenal of techniques for reviving weak or struggling infants. They might splash them with cold water or wine, tickle their feet and hands, or even blow into their mouth to stimulate the breath. Once breathing steadily, babies were then swaddled tightly in cloth strips, which were believed to soothe them and help their limbs grow straight. Only their head peeked out from their snug wrappings. Next came the matter of feeding the baby. Breastfeeding was recognized as the best way to nourish infants, and new mothers were encouraged to nurse early and often. But first, the baby needed to ingest a substance called colostrum, the antibody-rich concentrated milk produced in the first few days after birth. Today we know that colostrum helps jumpstart a baby's immune system. In the Middle Ages, however, it was viewed with suspicion. Many people believed that colostrum was stale, unhealthy milk that had been sitting in the breasts for months. As a result, some babies were either fed other foods or nursed by a wet nurse for the first day or two until the mother's mature milk came in. These practices likely deprived infants of the protective benefits of colostrum, contributing to high rates of newborn illness and death. Breastfeeding was a cornerstone of infant care in the Middle Ages, but it was far from a simple matter. Sore, cracked nipples were a common complaint, and infections like mastitis posed serious risks in a time before antibiotics. If a mother had inverted nipples or otherwise had trouble nursing, babies could quickly become malnourished. For aristocratic women, breastfeeding was often delegated to wet nurses. Employing a wet nurse was seen as a status symbol and a way for noble mothers to resume their social duties without being tied down nursing. However, wet nursing contracts from the period reveal the many stipulations attached to this intimate yet fraught arrangement. Wet nurses, often poor women who were nursing their own babies, were subject to intense scrutiny and control by their employers. According to one 15th century contract from Florence, the wet nurse was required to not get pregnant, not have sexual intercourse, not drink alcohol, not eat garlic or onions, not get angry, not be in crowds, not work in smoky or dusty places, and to return to the baby's house to nurse every time she left. The document underscores the immense pressure on wet nurses to maintain ideal conditions for feeding their highborn charges. Whether nourished by their mother's milk or a wet nurse's, babies in the Middle Ages faced an uphill battle to survive infancy. It's estimated that 30 to 50% of children died before the age of 5, succumbing to disease, accidents, and malnutrition. In the face of such staggering loss, having a large family was almost a necessity to ensure that some children would live to adulthood. Among the wealthy and powerful, bearing many children could be a source of dynastic pride, even as it took a physical toll. Blanche of Castile, the 13th century Queen of France, embodied this tension. As a young bride, Blanche secured her place in the royal family by giving King Louis the 8th male heir he needed. She would go on to bear 12 children in just 15 years, an astonishing feat of fertility by any measure. But Blanche's many pregnancies left her with permanent health problems, including what was likely a painful rectovaginal fistula. After the difficult birth of her youngest child in 1226, she decided her childbearing days were over, much to her husband's chagrin. When Louis demanded she submit to his sexual advances so they could have another son, Blanche flatly refused, declaring, "What you are asking, you will never have, unless God and my soul are first separated from my body." It was a stunning assertion of bodily autonomy from a queen who had already risked so much to secure the royal line. Blanche of Castile's resolve reflects a broader current of women's resistance that rippled through the Middle Ages, even in the face of oppressive gender norms and limited medical care. Again and again, we see women claiming a say over their reproductive destinies. The mystic Marjorie Kempe finding spiritual rebirth after a traumatic first delivery. The wet nurse negotiating the terms of her employment. The village midwife entrusted with shepherding new life into the world. These women drew strength from a reservoir of embodied feminine knowledge passed down from generation to generation, often in the form of herbal remedies, charms, and prayers. They leaned on other women in their communities for support and solidarity through the trials of menstruation, pregnancy, and the postpartum period. In an era when the medical establishment was dominated by men, this feminine folk wisdom often operated outside the bounds of formal medicine. Male physicians were generally not involved in childbirth itself, viewing it as the domain of midwives. Instead, their role was to provide advice and remedies to promote conception and ensure a healthy pregnancy. One popular medical handbook from the 13th century, the Trotula, offered all sorts of prescriptions for provoking the menses and treating various gynecological ailments. It recommended herbal concoctions containing ingredients like mugwort, myrrh, and even ground-up beaver testicles, thought to have warming properties to stimulate the womb. To ease the pain of childbirth, labouring mothers were advised to eat foods like groats cooked in milk, parsley, and flax meal. But the trotula also included more esoteric remedies that straddled the line between medicine and magic. A woman struggling to conceive, for instance, was instructed to take the womb of a hare, burn it, and drink the ashes with wine. She should also wear a charm made from a pod of a peony plant around her neck. To protect the fetus from evil humours, an expectant mother should carry a jasper stone or a coral amulet. These folk practices may seem primitive or superstitious to modern minds, but they reflect a holistic understanding of women's health that recognise the interplay of physical, emotional and spiritual factors. And in some cases, they anticipated later scientific discoveries. Midwives' use of ergot fungus to stimulate contractions and stem postpartum bleeding, for instance, was validated in the 20th century when ergot alkaloids were isolated and used to develop medications like methogyne. Moreover, the medieval emphasis on social support and community care during key reproductive transitions has been borne out by modern research. Studies have shown that continuous labour support from a doula or other companion can reduce the risk of complications and improve outcomes for both mother and baby. The postpartum period of lying in, while rooted in outdated ideas about female fragility, created a protected space for new mothers to rest, heal, and bond with their infants, a practice modern parents are rediscovering in the form of baby moons. As we've travelled back in time to trace the history of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth in the medieval era, what stands out is the resilience and ingenuity of women in the face of formidable challenges. Though lacking in modern obstetric knowledge, medieval people developed a rich body of practices and beliefs around women's embodied experiences, some surprisingly insightful and others misguided. Women claimed power where they could, whether by voicing dissent like Marjorie Kemper, controlling their fertility like Blanche of Castile, or serving their communities as knowledgeable midwives. They drew on shared wisdom and leaned on each other for support in navigating the most intimate moments of the life cycle. While we may not want to return to medieval medical techniques, we can still learn from the strong feminine culture that anchored reproductive life in the Middle Ages. As we continue to fight for women's bodily autonomy and advocate for more humane, holistic models of care, we should remember the generations of women who came before us, birthing and bleeding and finding ways to flourish against all odds. And so, we come to the end of our journey through the history of periods, pregnancy, and childbirth in medieval times. It's been a fascinating exploration of how women in the Middle Ages faced these momentous life events with a mix of ancient wisdom, communal support, and sheer resilience in the face of daunting odds. From the early days of puberty and the onset of menstruation, medieval girls learned to manage their monthly cycles using the limited resources available to them. They relied on absorbent materials like rags, moss, and wool to catch the flow, and often turned to herbal remedies to ease cramps and discomfort. While superstitions around menstrual blood abounded, some enlightened thinkers like Hildegard of Bingen approached the topic with a refreshing frankness and medical curiosity remarkable for the time. As women entered the stage of life when they were expected to bear children, they faced a whole new set of challenges and dangers. Prenatal care was rudimentary by modern standards, guided by a mix of folk wisdom, religious beliefs, and the advice of experienced midwives. Expectant mothers were encouraged to stay active, but avoid overexertion, eat well, but not to excess, and pray for a safe delivery. Still, the spectre of complications loomed large, and far too many women did not survive the ordeal of childbirth. Those who did had to rely on the skill of their midwives and the support of other women to see them through. From the candlelit hush of the birth chamber to the joyful first cries of the newborn, medieval childbirth was an intense, transformative experience, one that could bring either life or death. In the vulnerable postpartum period, new mothers were usually confined to bed for several weeks, cared for by a rotating cast of female relatives and attendants. This lying-in time was seen as crucial for the mother to rest and recover, and for the baby to bond with its mother and begin breastfeeding. Although attitudes around nursing, like so much else in the medieval worldview, were shaped by a combination of practical necessity, moral beliefs, and sometimes outright superstition. Looking back from our vantage point today, it's easy to be grateful for how far we've come in terms of women's healthcare. The advent of modern medicine and sanitation has dramatically reduced the risks that medieval mothers faced, while giving us options and interventions those women could scarcely have imagined. At the same time, there is wisdom in how medieval women approach these stages as natural parts of life, to be supported by community and honored as powerful, sacred experiences. In a world that can often feel isolating and overwhelming, especially for new parents, perhaps the most enduring lesson we can take from medieval mothers is the importance of sharing our stories, supporting each other through the tough times, and trusting in the deep instinctual knowledge that resides in each of us. Because raising the next generation has never been easy, but it's always been one of the most meaningful things we can do. And on that note, I'll wish you a restful good night. If you've enjoyed this quiet meander through the annals of history, I do hope you'll like, subscribe, and join me again for more bedtime tales of times gone by. There are so many fascinating stories just waiting to be discovered and rediscovered in our dreams. Until next time, dear listener, sleep well.